and this is Pompeii. It's not your average Italian town. It is the name given to an ancient city that was completely buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD. When most people hear about Pompeii, they think of Mount Vesuvius, which did indeed smother the town along with several others. Today we're going to look at what really happened in Pompeii and how the destruction of this city has affected our perception of history ever since it was rediscovered. Let's get into it. But it wasn't just this mountain. In fact, there were two that unleashed hellfire upon these unfortunate souls. You know, when someone calls a place or event the Sodom and Gomorrah of the ancient world, it isn't referring to their staggering architectural achievements. They had earthquakes, corruption, social unrest, and sexually transmitted diseases. But despite its flaws, the vast majority of Pompeians loved their home. These are things like shoes, jewelry, and even food. We can see that the residents of Pompeii were normal people. They had interests and hobbies, just like us. And to top it off, the citizens were apparently not very well prepared for their looming doom. Now, does any of that sound familiar? Well, if so, it probably means that what we know of Pompeii is true. In the Forum, the main square of the city, you could buy anything from fish to prostitutes. Now, obviously, the service wasn't great. Taverns were basically open sheds with a few beds inside. They attracted all sorts of unwanted guests, including snakes and rats. For centuries, its citizens had been warned that Mount Vesuvius was a ticking time bomb. Earthquakes and tremors were common occurrences. Entire buildings had collapsed without warning. On occasion, valuables went missing, and occasionally guests were found dead in their beds. Street vendors sold cups of wine and small meals, and taverns offered cheap rooms for rent, though not exactly for the purpose you might think. During the time period, gladiators weren't necessarily slaves. The entire city was covered in a thick layer of ash, and the suffocating fine particles of pumice made breathing almost impossible. In the end, the surrounding cities took over Pompeii and sold the abandoned property at auctions. Since no one wanted to live there, the items went for next to nothing. 2,000 people lost their lives. The new owners didn't care about the previous owner's lifestyle. All they cared about was getting a good deal. Many others managed to flee. Another factor that influenced this view was the condition of the city itself. Most of these casts were created in the 19th century, long after the initial excavations. Guess that in the end, everything above ground was covered in a thick layer of mud and pumice, which preserved the ruins underneath. Means that, now, while some of these bolts hit the ground and ignited forests, others ripped straight through the ash, turning night into day. Everything that the residents touched became contaminated, meaning that the water wasn't safe to drink or use for cooking. Pompeii, many of the victims didn't die immediately from injuries or suffocation. Instead, they died from bacterial infections that entered their body through their skin. In fact, it was a fairly average city whose inhabitants were mostly poor. Yes, Pompeii was a city full of life, passion, and maybe a little too much indulgence. But the truth is that it was also a victim of circumstance, a city full of normal people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately, we tend to forget that Pompeii wasn't a huge city, nor was it the largest victim of the eruption. If you'd like to support us, please check out the links below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Reputation, as only a few square miles were covered in ash, meaning that it was robbed extensively and is now a shadow of its former self. But now it's been turned into something else. A cautionary tale of what happens when a volcano has a bad hair day. The valuable items that did exist were taken away, but for the most part, the city was left intact. Decadent city is partly due to a marketing campaign, but there's truth in every lie. So let's go over what actually happened to Pompeii, and how it compares to popular belief. They were made to attract more tourists and therefore more money, but they left their homes and belongings behind. The excavators poured plaster into the cavities left by bodies that had decomposed. This gave us some incredibly realistic depictions of Pompeians in their final moments, frozen in a desperate attempt to save themselves. They came from all social classes and were sometimes paid handsomely for their work. Though the locals eventually realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. It was safe, it was lively, and for the most part, it was prosperous. There were even academies where future gladiators could learn their fighting styles. Pompeii wasn't destroyed in a single day. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius lasted for 18 hours, over 2 days. It began with a series of smaller explosions that showered the surrounding area with rocks and pumice. Looters had already cleaned up most of the valuable stuff, so the only thing that remained was the cheap furniture and fixtures. This led to gladiators becoming stars in their own right and earning immense wealth. It was a clear, sunny day when the citizens of Pompeii heard a loud roar in the distance. The sky was filled with smoke and ash. But instead of panicking, the locals just shrugged and carried on with their daily activities. By 79 AD, the tremors had stopped, and the Pompeians thought they'd dodged a bullet. However, they had no idea that their greatest tragedy was just around the corner. One of the most popular tourist attractions in Pompeii was the large amphitheater in the center of the city. It could hold up to 20,000 spectators and was used for theatrical performances, animal hunts, and On the 24th, the second deadliest eruption in the volcano's history began. Solid pieces of magma rained down on the city, and after 2 days, a cloud of ash rose 20 miles into the air. Of course, it wasn't as taboo back then, but the amount of artwork depicting sexual acts is quite striking. If not, then maybe it was all just a lie. Pompeii was apparently pretty bad, but Pompeians still found out about them and flocked to the amphitheater to watch these magnificent spectacles. We know this because the archaeologists found taverns and brothels near the amphitheater, meaning that people stayed for days waiting for the fights to begin. At its peak, around 80,000 of those people lived in Pompeii, making it one of the largest cities in the entire empire. Goods from Africa, Asia, and other parts of Europe flowed through this city, fueling its economy and the wallets of the elite few. With such high stakes, the politicians of Pompeii were constantly at each other's throats, always arguing about who should control the lucrative positions. That would be about the same size as modern-day San Diego, and it happened much more suddenly than you might imagine. Hi everyone. It's now common knowledge that Pompeii was a very flawed city. It's become a synonym for decadent vice and debauchery. We often hear about Pompeii as being some sort of warning for us today. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire spanned across 3 continents, and its population exceeded 5 million. Pompeii was also right on the water. Its port was the busiest in the whole region. The frequent power struggles in combination with the natural disasters that struck the city made it a less than desirable destination for anyone looking for some peace of mind. We know this because the archaeological site contains thousands of artifacts that were left behind in such a hurry that they were never recovered by the survivors. They loved sports, gambling, and gladiator games. But perhaps the most scandalous activity that took place within its walls was the fights between the gladiators. Now obviously, these fights were brutal and bloody, so the authorities tried to keep them secret. And while archaeologists have discovered evidence of public brothels, brothel-like establishments, and houses of prostitution, you won't need to look further than the frescoes on the walls of private residences to see that the Pompeians weren't shy about their love for sexual activity. Pompeii was truly a city of indulgence. When I say cheap, I mean dirt cheap. A night in a tavern cost the equivalent of a few $25 in today's money. So yes, technically you got what you paid for. Despite these setbacks, Pompeii was still a great city. That was until the mountain blew its top. Pompeii had a serious problem, and yet they rebuilt and carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened. On August of that year, Mount Vesuvius, it would be another 2 days before they realized how wrong they were. To make matters worse, the prevailing winds pushed the ash onto the unsuspecting city, pummeling its residents with rocks, hot enough to burn skin and hair, within hours. And that's where we got the myth that Pompeii was a city of debauchery. After the disaster, people from nearby Herculaneum bought furniture, ornaments, and statues for pennies on the dollar. That meant that many of the beautiful frescoes with sexual themes ended up in brothels and taverns. Hence the modern perception of Pompeii. When excavations began in the 18th century, finally, the cherry on top of this misrepresentation was the discovery of plaster casts of victims to make these casts. But here's the thing, contrary to popular opinion, then, as the days passed, a thick layer of ash covered the entire city. Mount Vesuvius didn't do this alone. It had company. While Vesuvius unleashed hellfire from the ground, Mount Capparovecchia shot massive bolts of lightning into the sky. Scientists believe that the magma coming out of Vesuvius ionized the ash clouds, creating gigantic electrical If that wasn't scary enough, poisonous sulfur gases also filled the air. They caused acid rain that poisoned the water supply. And, while it may seem odd to worry about potable water when you're trying to survive a volcanic eruption, it was this factor that ultimately saved many As you can see, surviving the initial blast wouldn't have been easy. Of the 11 Roman cities that were destroyed during this eruption, Pompeii was neither the wealthiest nor the most influential. Pompeii's relative poverty shielded it from the wrath of looters. On the contrary, Herculaneum was largely destroyed by molten lava flows and mud. Pompeii was once seen as a warning to other cities. proof that greed and lust could bring even the mightiest of empires to their knees. As you can see, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to our supporters.